welcome to Silux, the podcast where we talk about scientific developments and technological changes in Luxembourg, sometimes not, but today in Luxembourg, which means we are recording at the Media Center of the University of Luxembourg, and we are powered by Research Luxembourg. And our guest today is Dr. Thomas Gibon, who is a Research and Technology Associate at Luxembourg Institute of Science and Technology, so LIST. Thomas wants to help our societies answer questions about climate change mitigation. And you can bet there will be a lot of questions asked and hopefully also answered as well. Thomas, thank you so much for coming today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor.
Let's start with the base. You have not a very linear path, because I noticed that there is a little bit of electric mobility, a little bit of hydrogen, low carbon production of basic materials. But is there one thing you would specialize in actually or not?
Well, that's a very interesting question. I think the main and short answer to that is that my group specializes in the methods of sustainability assessment. And these methods can be applied to any kind of product, services, technology, even territories. One of the main methods we use is called Lifecycle Sustainability Assessment.
Long word.
Yes, LCA for short, Lifecycle Assessment. And you can apply that to any kind of technology you would like to understand the environmental impacts of. So technically, electric cars, hydrogen production, as you mentioned, but also just lifestyles or even... So you can, by nature, apply it to a lot of topics. And it's a method that also forces you to look at the entire system. I will just take an example. Do you know the acronym BECCS? BECCS? No. Stands for Bioenergy and Carbon Capture and Storage. It's basically a power plant where you burn biomass to make heat or electricity, often both, actually. So you will start by analyzing how much biomass you need, for example, to produce that much electricity, that much heat. But then quickly you will understand that in such a system, you will also have to capture CO2. You will need some equipment to capture between 50 and 90% of CO2 in the best cases. You need to start understanding what is being made with the CO2, how it's being transported. And upstream, you will need to start understanding where the biomass comes from. Are you using forest residues, energy crops? And little by little, you will have to start to understand the whole system, even though it ranges from forestry to chemistry to engineering. And so by nature, this is a method that will actually just lead you to touch a lot of topics. Of course, on most projects, we have partners that are experts in these different parts that help us collecting the data. But this is a method that, as I said, forces you to get a systemic approach.
But then the systemic approach is only good if you have good data. And that's a problem,
yes.
I think, or not?
This is correct. Yeah, that's why in most projects we have experts that will actually help us understanding how to model the forest growth, for example. How much carbon uptake happens, how much you actually get emitted when you burn the biomass, etc. In some cases, you don't have this, and then we rely on generic databases that already contains some kind of a generic average of the technology we're using. So we're not left alone having to every time collect data on things, for example, the steel that was made to produce the truck that will transport my fuel that will actually supply that plant. No, we already have some generic data on that.
But what I see in the discussions is that there are a lot of claims, and those claims don't seem to be taking into consideration the whole life cycle assessment. So does it make you angry? Do you want to already comment on all the things that people say? I love this example of avocado as a solution to certain problems. Let's not eat red meat, let's eat avocado. But there's always, exactly, when you start looking into the need of water, the farmland and whatever, this doesn't look as good as you would maybe think, or the transport cost as well, if you're shipping it from somewhere. So how does it work for you? When is the moment when you say, okay, now I have to step in, and when you just say, okay, I'm not going to comment?
Oh, there are many moments. No, what I like with our work is that it really helps fighting misconceptions about environmental impacts. For example, things like green electricity, green hydrogen. If you produce hydrogen from an electrolyzer, which is what we expect we will be doing in a few years, it's only green if you use truly low carbon electricity. Today, if you plug this electrolyzer to the European grid, to the average European electricity, you will actually emit more CO2 than the hydrogen you produce the conventional way with natural gas. So it's really trying to raise awareness against shortcuts like this. It's the same with the zero emission car. No, of course, it's zero emission in the use phase, but you need to produce the electricity that supplies the battery, that supplies the motor. You need to produce the battery, you need to produce the car. So there's a lot of things you need to consider. And that's why I think life cycle assessment is important.
For me, whenever we talk about systems thinking, I get tired by talking, because I'm thinking like, oh God, like where do you start, right? And as you're saying, there are so many limitations as well. So what is the most surprising limitation that you've discovered looking at the whole system? I don't know, be it in electric mobility or hydrogen technologies?
Yeah, that's a very good question, because there are limitations in the sense that you always have to nuance your message. For example, we will be able to cut CO2 emissions when using electromobility by adopting electric cars, mostly because they are really efficient in converting primary energy to movement, much more than diesel or gasoline cars. That's just due to the fact that the electric powertrain is just itself very efficient. A conventional car is basically a heater on wheels, right? You lose 60-70% of the energy in heat, and the rest is used to move the car. So based on that, one surprising fact is that actually electric cars are a very efficient tool also to save energy, and then of course to save CO2 if you manage to supply this car with low carbon electricity. So we will definitely need more of electric cars and to replace and to discard older cars. It's a long process. Of course, it will happen over the lifetime of a car. So at least 15, 20 years until we see some changes. But then the limitation of that is that, of course, we're only talking about energy and CO2. And there are other aspects, traffic jams. A car is still a car, in a sense. There's this saying that the future of the car is electric, but the future of mobility should probably be something else than a car. So that's one limitation. So if you compare car to car, it's great. But if you consider things in their, as you say, systemic approach, sorry if you get tired, it's a bit more complicated. Yeah. And for hydrogen, it's a bit the same. It's a problem of scale. So the idea of producing hydrogen with low carbon electricity is very good, because that's the main way we will be able to produce hydrogen without emitting CO2, because right now we're doing it by cracking molecules of methane, which as a process emits CO2. You can't really avoid that unless you equip your plants with CCS, which is very costly. Anyway, we'll try to develop green hydrogen, but this needs a lot of low carbon electricity, and we will probably not have enough low carbon electricity for all the hydrogen applications we are expecting, from cars to planes to ships to everything.
Listeners, if you're interested in hydrogen as such, there is a very interesting discussion we had also with your list colleague, Robin White, about hydrogen itself. And he's also very good. I love it when he sometimes steps in when he gets a little bit annoyed by certain claims. It's great to read him as well, but also listen to him. So we will share the link in the show notes. But for hydrogen, I keep asking it whenever I have a chance. So I will ask you as well. There was a moment when the technologies were more or less developed at the same time. Now we had the idea, okay, let's have hydrogen cars, let's have electric cars. What happened that it's electric and not hydrogen?
Well, fuel cells have existed for a long time. So clearly we could have produced hydrogen cars a long time ago. The main issue is, again, efficiency. So if you have, let's say, a wind park, so with wind turbines, it's much more efficient to actually produce electricity to supply a battery to supply movement to a car. So you end up with maybe 7 out of 10 wind turbines at the wheel, if you say. If you do the same with hydrogen, you have to go through a much longer process. You have to go first through an electrolyzer to produce the hydrogen. You have to compress it, to transport it, to distribute it. There's also losses along the way. And then once you put it in your car, you will have to convert this hydrogen back into electricity. So hydrogen cars are electric cars. They just store energy differently. And this hydrogen will not be used entirely to move the car because of the conversion process in the fuel cell. And then the electric motor itself also has like a 90% efficiency. So you will end up with maybe 3 wind turbines for 10 wind turbines you already had to produce the electricity. It's basically not efficient enough. Plus the fact that electricity is already available more or less everywhere, which is not the case at all for hydrogen. You have to build the entire infrastructure of transport and distribution. It's more dangerous to manipulate. It's rather explosive, especially compressed. It requires a completely different type of infrastructure and safety measures, and which are not ready yet. And that's probably why electricity is just so much easier to use right now.
But should we get them ready?
We should get them ready, but I would argue not probably for private mobility. Right now, we already use about 100 million tons of hydrogen in the world, but it's not at all for mobility and it's not even for energy purposes. We use it to make synthetic fertilizers and to desulfurize fossil fuels, basically to use into your car. So right now, the hydrogen we use is not even energy hydrogen. Nonetheless, we still need to replace the hydrogen that's being produced by emitting carbon right now with this low carbon hydrogen. So the first priority is to develop green hydrogen to supply the industrial facilities that produce fertilizers and fuels. And then if we manage to actually get this rolling, get the ball rolling with enough investments, then maybe we'll have more hydrogen for other applications.
Okay, the first priority. There are other priorities in other sectors as well, right? So when we go into, building materials or materials you use, so steel, for example, what's going on there? Is it already low carbon?
Yeah, steel is a very interesting topic as well because there's a few production routes that could be used to make steel. The main one is to use blast furnaces to reduce iron ore. So that's what we call primary steel. And that's what Luxembourg has been doing right here until
Across the street.
Exactly,
basically.
96, 97. And of course, this produces CO2. And the problem is that it produces CO2 by the process itself. So even if you use low carbon energy to supply the heat and etc., you will still emit CO2. These processes are called hard to abate sectors. Basically, cement is another one. And what Luxembourg has done is to convert to electric furnaces. Those ones use scrap steel and they can produce new steel based on basically electricity and this scrap steel. Of course, it works only if you have scrap steel. You don't produce new steel at all. So the global demand is such today that scrap steel cannot meet the demand. You still have to produce more primary steel to fill the gap. Nonetheless, this is a very low-carbon way to do it. ArcelorMittal here has its own connection to France and Belgium, so they're also using very low-carbon electricity, which is good. It would not be as low-carbon if they used the other electricity we're connected to. And so that makes it very interesting in terms of mitigating carbon emissions from steelmaking. But due to the global demand, we will still have to produce primary steel. And this can be done in other ways. You can reduce directly your iron ore also with hydrogen. Again, that's one way. Under the condition that your hydrogen is truly low carbon, then your steel becomes low carbon.
This is interesting what you said about how we're getting the energy from other countries, right? Because I love that discussion in Luxembourg about we're going to go, low carbon, we're going to change whatever. But then it's always a question, okay, so where do you get it from, right? And as we are importing a lot of it, I don't know what the percentages are. Do you remember?
70 to 80%, depending on the year.
Yeah, and you can't just, when you're buying it, you can't just say, hey, guys, yeah, we'll buy it, but give us the green one, right?
Yes.
I don't think it works like that.
Yes, it's a very hot topic in our discipline because we're based on physical accounting. Basically, we try to allocate emissions that really, truly happened, and that could be assigned to you because of your consumption. There are two ways to account for energy, and it's also interesting that you mix the word energy and electricity. You're talking about electricity when we import 70 to 80. Energy, we actually import 95% maybe. And so the issue right now is that, of course, you cannot choose the electricity you're consuming. You're fixed in a location. Whatever you get from the outlet is the same as what your neighbor has from your outlet. If you have a different contract, and maybe you have one with your electricity provider that tells you you're using green electricity, this is a market convention that the electricity provider buys certificates from across Europe. And it goes from Norway to even Iceland, which is not even connected to the European grid, to claim that somewhere 1 megawatt hour of green electricity, so renewable, has been used or has been produced whenever you consumed 1 megawatt hour of electricity. This has nothing to do with even timing because this megawatt hour was produced last year. So in the middle of winter, you can consume 1 megawatt hour of solar electricity, which was produced last year in Spain. There's absolutely no connection. But that's the only way consumer can sort of choose their electricity. For environmental accounting, this is actually allowed in corporate carbon accounting, for example. This is called the market-based modeling. So you can just account for the certificates you bought and, just basically scratch off your electricity contribution, put it to zero, just because you gave a few euros more per megawatt hour. It's also very cheap. So clearly it has no effect. At least most of them have no effect on what actually happens. Most of them are also old hydropower plants from Scandinavia, for example. Clearly, these companies will not build new hydropower plants based on that. So, yeah, this is the market-based approach. And what we focus on and what we strive for is to keep what we call the location-based approach, which is the electricity truly used at the time and the location you're in, which in many cases is very different from the one that you claim with certificates. So in effect, the location-based consumption electricity of Luxembourg is still fossil-based. It's still nuclear-based because we have connections with Belgium, which produces nuclear. The only connection with France is actually for ArcelorMittal. So it's not on the public grid. And then 2 interconnectors with Germany that exports to us basically the mix they have now, which is increasingly renewable, still contains some coal, lignite, and gas.
I have to admit something. I did mix energy and electricity on purpose because we discussed it before preparing for this interview right now. Because as you were saying, many people mix it. So I mixed it. I was actually checking if you're listening. You were listening. That's very good. But now let's tell the listeners who still mix what's wrong with this mix and why are we doing it?
Well, yeah. Globally, electricity is only about 20% of energy. In some countries, it can be higher, 25, 30% in France, for example. But most of the energy that the world uses is still fossil fuels. The world pretty much runs on oil. For transportation, that's the main, by far, energy carrier we use. Coal for electricity. Well, coal to produce electricity, which then composes only a small share of the energy. And then gas, increasingly mostly for industry. The fossil share of our energy mix hasn't really changed in 10 years, at least globally. It went maybe from 85 to 80% roughly in about 20 years. So the progression is slow also because we consume much more energy globally. So that's a bit of an issue. But we have to remember that most of the energy we use is not even electricity at all. It's mostly the oil you put in your car, the gas you have in your gas heater, and all the gas and oil that is used to produce all the stuff we have around us, to transport it. Transporting things around is basically essential to our economy. We run on transport, on logistics, on energy in general, and that emits a lot of CO2, and that is mainly fossil fuels right now.
Talking of transport, I think this is a good moment for you to ask your pub quiz question as well. So we go into aviation right now. And listeners, remember, the question is asked right now, but the answer only at the end of the podcast.
So it's quite a long question. You have to pay attention.
You can always rewind as well.
Okay, very good. So the question is, if aviation, and especially European aviation, kept growing as it is growing right now, by 2050, if we manage to decarbonize all the planes that are used in Europe by using synthetic fuels, which are based on hydrogen, which itself is made with electricity, how much of the current electricity production of Europe would we need to supply this fleet of planes? So is it 20% of it, 50% of it, 80% of it, or 130% of it?
And as I said, answer only at the end of the podcast. Okay, a few more buzzwords. We talked a little bit already about hydrogen and some other things. So now we go into decoupling, let's say, right? So in one of the episodes a couple of months ago, I was discussing, degrowth as well and all these ideas. I also invite you to listen to it because it's actually more on empowering communities and what we can do on a local level. But very, very interesting. I will share the link in the show notes. But right now, we are still in this place, at least some of the countries, where we're supposed to grow all the time, right? So is it possible actually to separate the emissions from the growth? Should we stop growing? What's your idea?
Yes, very hot topic again. So decoupling refers to the fact that you would be able to keep growing your GDP, monetary GDP, by reducing your environmental impacts. It doesn't have to be only about climate. It can be about, pressure on biodiversity, land use, water stress, any kind of indicator you would like to see. Actually, there is evidence that temporarily some countries have managed to do this, even if you take into account imported emissions. So the fact that some of the stuff we consume here actually produced elsewhere. If you only account for our emissions, then it would be easy to decouple. You just, produce and import elsewhere. But even if you take that into account, there are examples of countries that managed, and it's mostly temporarily because in the short term, you can transition to a low carbon economy. So basically, if you are aggressive enough by replacing your fossil fuels with low carbon energy, then during that time, there is a possibility that you observe decoupling. The thing is that it's not possible in the long term in sustainable ways. and not globally, because we have billions of people that also try to reach standards of living that we have. So we cannot do without this. Electricity and energy usage will increase, which means probably in the medium term, more emissions. So it's not really possible. But it is necessary. What convinced me is actually a paper by Jason Hickel, who was actually recently in Luxembourg, and Georgios Kallis, which says that if you keep growing the global GDP by about 2% per year, you will need to reduce emissions by 6% per year to reach our at least 2-degree target. 1.5 is another story and it's probably passed already. But that convinced me that probably we would need decoupling and to focus on something else than monetary GDP. The main reason is that 6% of decrease of emissions is what we experienced a few years ago with lockdowns. And now you have to imagine that this would need to be applied every year on year, until we reach net neutrality. And clearly, this is not something that, well, first, that people want. And I don't think it's even desirable in a way that it restricts a lot of movement and it's not really the life people want. So either we find a miracle solution, or we try to question the fact that GDP is probably not the best metric to account for growth. Or, there are people at LISA also and Statec working on metrics of well-being and basically post-growth metrics.
Okay, you mentioned another buzzword I wanted to discuss, so desirability. I never even whether something is desirable. That's better. What you work on, it's not only about the data, of course, and the story behind the data, but it's a lot about talking to people and trying to show them the right path, let's say, which is very, very tricky. We're actually going to social sciences right now, but do you think that we can really make people think that low carbon future is desirable?
Yeah, thanks for the warning first. This is outside now of my research expertise. But you have to ask that question, basically. What is desirable? Because when you take a cold approach as an engineer, as we usually do in my discipline of, okay, to reduce emissions, we have to do this, that, and that. But this is good on paper. To transfer this to the real world, you need a lot of work. And there are mainly two ways, I believe, to change things in an efficient way. You can take the short-term path, which is to tax and ban and, all policy measures, maybe put high price on carbon, but we know that this doesn't work without pedagogy. In France, a few years back, we had this issue. The other way is the long-term way, I would say, but it's to actually change habits is a bit pretentious, but to actually be pedagogic about what we need to do to be in a better place. And for this, you have to come up with narratives, so with ideas of what it would mean to live in a low-carbon world. And this is also something that many people are doing. We had this initiative a few years ago called Luxembourg in Transition, where basically we did exactly that. We first did the math about what would it mean to be sustainable in Luxembourg and in the greater region. And how does that translate to the real world? So basically, we would need to develop better infrastructures to use more soft mobility, this concept of 15-minute city. A lot of this, more social cohesion, make sure that social justice is ensured by having, these common areas where people could meet. There's a lot of very interesting ideas coming from those studies.
And it's perfect. Our discussion today is just leading to a lot of different discussions I've already had. So I invite you to also look for other discussions we had. I will share them in the show notes exactly about how, in general, green parts of the city influence how we feel and how important it is. We also discussed the 15-minute city idea. And also what you were saying in the recent interview with Professor Mike Schaefer about science communication, we were talking a little bit about the deficit model. So from the science communication part, there is this tendency, especially for scientists, researchers, when they communicate about their research, to say, okay, it's just a question of deficit. I will tell them what the situation is, people will know, and they will change their habits, right?
We're more complicated than that. We're social animals. So we change because we see our neighbor has done something different or some celebrity has done something different. My dream is that, what happened with, I think it was Cristiano Ronaldo a few years back. He snubbed a bottle of Coca-Cola to ask for a bottle of water, and the Coca-Cola stock actually went down $4 billion or something like this. What if someone like this decided, all of a sudden, I only take public transport, or I only do this, or I cut my meat consumption? What kind of impact would it have? So desirability is also through the images of success that we convey. It's about what it means to live a happy life. So it's quite complex. And I believe by just telling people the facts, nothing will really happen. You have to paint a picture.
2 days ago, I saw an interview with, out of all the people, Ed Sheeran. I was not searching, it just popped up, algorithms. And he was talking about the fact that he doesn't have a private jet. And I was thinking, these rich people. But actually, the journalist was like, but what do you mean? And how do you manage? And whatever. And I was thinking, it's a different level of resigning from things, but we have to start somewhere, right?
This is how low the bar is right now, yes.
Yeah, this is a bit sad as well, but fair enough, yeah. And then they started talking about whether there's business class in Ryanair. Anyway, coming back to fighting climate change. So we're saying, that this idea of being desirable, as you also mentioned, I don't want to be introducing bans, but I really don't think that people will not get there without taking serious measures and limiting themselves big time. It will all be about our quality of life. Do you agree with that?
Yes, it's a very interesting question because we always imagine right away that, we will just use candles, back to, using horses. I don't know. There's a lot of things people imagine because they're just afraid of change. And I totally understand that. The thing is, actually, with all the solutions we would implement, quality of life, I believe, would actually improve. If you try, and for those lucky among us to be able to leave the car at the garage and to use the bike or to walk, use public transport to go to work, this is actually a very healthy activity. If you actually manage to discard or at least phase out most of fossil fuel mobility, you improve air quality in cities. You actually reduce, and it's measurable, the number of asthma cases yearly. Same with electricity. Thousands of people die today because coal power plants, even in Europe, actually emit particles, etc. So you're actually increasing your quality of life. If you try to reduce your meat consumption, same thing. There's a lot of aspects of it that are actually very, very beneficial to you. And that's only for the health aspect. If you take into account the economic aspects, it's the same. Right now, I can't really talk about the future, but it's more economical actually to use an electric car than a conventional car. In Luxembourg, it's kind of equal because electricity prices have risen and fuel is still cheap, but depends on the evolution of both those prices in the future. So even for your wallets, changing your heating system to a heat pump, insulation, all of this in the long term pays off and you're actually better off economically as well. So in the end, I'm actually not sure what you're talking about when you say quality of life.
We're very much based in Luxembourg. So I have to ask you, where do you live in Luxembourg?
Yeah, I live in France, actually, in Cirque-les-Bains at the border with Schengen.
Do you come here by train every day?
No, I used to come by bus and the bus was cancelled. Now I drive.
So I'm asking you about it because, I also have researchers sometimes. I remember there was one who was talking about some couple stuff, like what you're supposed to do for the share of duties at home. And then I actually asked him and he was like, yeah, well, this is theory, but then there is practice, right?
Yeah,
but I'm asking about this, not because to say, well, you see, you're not doing what you're just saying. Yeah. I'm asking about it because unfortunately, very often, and I don't want to put the blame somewhere else, but very often it's also the options we have to switch. Yeah. So if that bus was cancelled, there you go. Of course, you have to ask why it was cancelled. Yeah. Probably the demand was not there.
That's what the ministry, I harassed them to get an explanation. I want my bus back. But yes, basically that's the issue. But we bought an electric car to do the trip. So technically the carbon footprint is more or less the same. But yeah, that's a question. Home office now has improved as well a lot. So yeah.
Of course. And then there is also the same for me. I came here by bus today and I have to say, as you're saying, quality of life, I enjoyed this ride so much. I had more time for myself. I could listen to a podcast, look around, get inspired, whatever. And then I saw a queue to the parking lot. I was thinking like, I don't have to queue. I don't have to pay for the parking. Amazing. But it took me an hour. And it would be 15 minutes by car. And this is, again, it's a question of maybe letting go somewhere. But then if you are leading a very busy life, an hour instead of 15 minutes, it's very difficult to give up. Yeah. So listeners, if you're thinking that we're now preaching to you and you're getting angry because how on earth are we going to do it? It's important, small steps. And we are not now trying to tell you to just completely drop everything you're doing in your life in order to become, serious. We have to be serious, but it's difficult and keep trying for sure.
Not giving orders. You have to start with whatever you think is the easiest for you, reduce meat consumption, I don't know, reduce flying, do more train. There's many ways you can already try adopt sustainable behaviors.
And I also don't want you to feel powerless, because that's also a problem, I think, because we've been talking serious stuff. At certain moment, there's even like a new thing people talk about, like climate anxiety or whatever that we're creating at schools, right? This is also bad when you just keep painting this super black, dire picture of the future.
Yes.
We don't want to do this either, right?
We don't want to do that.
So when you're at a party and people are like, ask you what you do, and you say, okay, I do that. And then they say, what can I do? What is your first answer?
The problem when you start understanding the problem is that, of course, it sounds overwhelming. So one first thing to do is to talk about it and to surround yourself with people who think the same. And I think it's good to be able to exchange on practices like this. Then you have, as I said, to start with things that will feel the easiest for you. For people who doesn't really care about traveling too much, then maybe flying less is an option. Eating less meat is definitely one. And especially in Luxembourg, because in Luxembourg, we start from very high. The carbon footprint of a Luxembourg resident is between 10 and 15 tons of CO2 equivalent per year, which is among the top carbon footprints in the world. Of course, you can be pessimistic about this because it's not good news, but half full glass is actually that you can do a lot actually to reduce your emissions. Emissions due to driving actually almost 3 tons per person. This is easily cut by, car sharing, changing your car for an electric car, public transport if you're lucky to have fast service, and things like this. It's the same with heating. We still have big houses in Luxembourg and the region that are still heated with fossil fuels, actually. I discovered that. I was quite surprised, but Luxembourg still heat their houses with, still fuel oil or gas. There's many ways you can change that. We're one of the richest countries in the world. What do you think other countries are going to say if we don't do anything while we have the means to change, right? For me, it's also a bit of a responsibility thing, leading by example. So there's a lot you can do, actually, especially because we're one of the richest countries on the planet and you actually have the means to do it.
Exactly. And that also makes me move to another subject in all this, so inequalities. As a rich country, preaching to people who are in a different situation is also not the solution, right? Because it's creating bigger and bigger inequalities, the transition.
Yes. I think there's this Nature paper that came out last month, so May 2025, that actually says that the top 10% income earners in the world are responsible for 50%, roughly, of emissions. So immediately you start, thinking, should we tax the rich, etc.? But you have to remember that we are the 10%. Everyone in Luxembourg is in the 10%. So this is also us, right? And then I think it depicts a different picture because we're always talking about how billionaires have private jets and all. No, that's billionaires. There's only a few hundreds on the planet. Let them do whatever. I mean, you should tax them still, but but it's not, of course, they can lead by example, but pragmatically, we also have to change whatever the top 10% is doing, right? What is the rest 90% going to say if we don't do anything? So there's this huge inequality. And it's not only international, in Luxembourg as well. So the first decile of income, so the bottom 10%, emits more or less 1/4 of what the top 10% is doing. So there's a ratio from 1 to 4 in personal carbon emissions already in Luxembourg. Just because, obviously, when you get a higher income, you consume more, you probably have a bigger car, more cars, you travel more by plane, you have a bigger house, etc. So this is highly correlated, climate and income. But there are, I believe, ways to reduce inequalities.
So we're touching upon climate policies right now. So what do you think? You said taxing. I don't know.
Yeah, well, most economists agree that, ideally a global carbon price is what you need to have. Both because that will reduce emissions of carbon, but also because then we could collect money to be able to invest in technologies to remove this carbon. Under 100, or let's be ambitious, 200 euros per ton of CO2, not many carbon capture and storage plants can actually run economically. You need to pay to discard this carbon, and who is going to pay for it? Carbon price. And you can introduce measures to reduce inequalities by making it a fee and dividend system. So basically, everyone pays for the carbon they emit, but it's getting redistributed to the lower income people so that they can actually afford the carbon intensive products. They need diesel to fill their cars, that kind of thing. And this is both reducing carbon inequalities and income inequalities. Yeah.
We're coming back to technologies then, but I thought that the carbon capture technology is not like ready to be applied everywhere.
Well, that's a problem, yeah. So there are many ways to... When we say CCS, we are talking about equipment that will actually be installed on power plants on site at the point of emission. So when you have off gas from an industrial process, you could actually capture between 50 and 90% of the CO2 that comes out, which is already great. You would be able to fix the carbon. Then the matter is what to do with this carbon. Increasingly, we're talking about carbon capture use and storage because there is still a market for CO2. Gasified beverages, for example, use CO2. There's many others, but that's the first one that came to mind. And that could be using the CO2 instead of producing it industrially. Of course, it's only recycling the CO2. You're not getting rid of it forever. But that's this part that's the hardest to implement. Basically, not many countries agree to bury CO2 underground. First, you need to find a place to do it. So old reservoirs could do that. Right now, the main way we do it is through enhanced oil recovery. So oil extraction. Basically, if you pump CO2 back to the reservoir, you help the oil getting out of it. It's great because you bury CO2, but you're still extracting oil. So on one hand, So CCS in general has a bit, I would say, under-delivered. It was touted as the main technology to reduce our carbon concentration, or at least carbon emissions. And then you have all the carbon dioxide reduction measures, such as direct air capture, which is another one that takes directly the carbon from the air. And this is also under-delivering. I don't know how much time we have to talk about this, but yeah.
Yeah, we don't have that much time, that's true. But I think we could have another podcast just on it, right? So, because today we're jumping so much and we are not really going very deep in all these technologies we're discussing. But I'm sure if you meet Thomas somewhere in the street, he'll be happy to explain more, or even if you write to him. And hopefully there will be a chance to really dig deep into all those technologies. But we talk technologies, I did it on purpose because I want to circle back a little bit and now, make you predict the future. I know that researchers don't like doing that, but looking at the market right now, what you're working with and whatever, what will be the next big thing, the next technology you are waiting for, you're hoping for, that will solve all the problems? No, maybe not all of them.
I think it would be very disappointing. I'm not really expecting any big technology breakthrough, and I will explain why. Basically, as far as environmental impacts, energy consumption, resource extraction is going, we haven't really had a technology in the past that reduced our consumption, our pressure on the planet, etc. The main problem is what we call the efficiency curse or the Jevons paradox. So there's this observation that was made by a guy called William Stanley Jevons in the, I believe, 1850s in England, who basically observed that there was this improvements in steam machines using coal at the time to produce, work for facilities, factories. And he kind of predicted that because of this, we will have less demand for coal, basically because machines were more efficient. But what happened was the exact opposite. Because it was just cheaper to get the same amount of work by buying less coal. Basically, everyone bought more of these machines and bought more coal. So the scale effect is that actually we had a higher demand in coal by making technology more efficient. And you see it all around you. So one light bulb was probably replaced by 10 LED lights in your house or here. I don't know. We made cars faster, more fuel efficient. So the result is that we just drive farther. We just go and live further from work. There's basically always this rebound effect that's set because of our habits. If it's just easier to do something, I will just do more of it. And so that's why I believe, I don't know if a technology breakthrough would be helping us in the same direction. Of course, it's great because that offers more possibility to be more efficient and more sufficient, which is basically choosing to consume less. But I'm not sure whether in the next decades or two, anything significant would happen. This is a long process as well. For example, decarbonization of electricity is taking time, and that's normal. It will be a gradual process rather than an actual breakthrough.
So then behavior or policy, or both actually, because it'd be policy that influences behavior.
Yeah, yes. I think it would be more a combination of both. Policy can be difficult, so there are decisions that are hard to make, basically banning the sales of new diesel and gasoline cars by 2035 is a very ambitious target. Let's see if this happens in reality or not, but at least it sends the right signals. But let's be optimistic. For example, you can think about the ban on smoking that happened already some time ago. At the time, it was deemed scandalous. It was like...
I was very happy, actually, I have to say.
Yeah, but I think a lot of people were thinking that it was just an attempt to their freedom, right? But a few years after, no one even talked about it. It was just normal. So I think we're really afraid of change. But when it happens, and especially after the fact, we just consider that it was normal. So I think we also have to think about this in the longer term. And sometimes an aggressive policy can actually be good. Of course, only aggressive policies is not a great thing. Anyway, no one will be elected on the promise of taxing everything or banning everything. But there are ways, I think it's a fine balance to find between what's acceptable and what you can actually not do as a policy.
Yeah, so there are ways also because you have to provide the data for the policymakers to take the right decisions. So what is keeping you up at night right now for your LCA work?
For the LCA work, I'm quite fine asleep quite well. But it's more on maybe back on this big picture question of growth. Growth is still the main driver today. But we know that in the long term, something will have to change because basically we're using resources as if it were a paycheck, but basically it's a trust fund. You can't extract fossil fuels, millions of barrels a day, just thinking that it will be there forever. At some point, something will change. Either fuel prices will be higher or with the consequences of climate change, more droughts, so maybe less agricultural production, so some, supply chain disruptions, even for us in Luxembourg. So something will change. The question I can't answer, and I don't think anyone can figure out, is whether we see this before it happens or we will just end up like going straight into a wall and maybe it will be a bit more painful to deal with it. So are we smart enough to anticipate this or not? That's the main question.
Yeah, but looking back at a few years, as you already mentioned, COVID, I don't know how much we can anticipate in general.
No, okay.
So, yeah, but
true.
This is something also that I did in my previous work. We discussed a lot, the whole idea of futures thinking and actually thinking of the future you want to have and then circling back to now what you need to do to get that future, right? So we could go there as well. And what remains is to solve, looking into the future, the pub quiz question that you asked our listeners. So if you can remind the listeners what the quiz was and then give us the answer.
So a shorter version of the question will be, how much electricity would you need to produce the hydrogen that serves to synthesize the fuel that you would use for all the planes that would be used by 2050 in Europe if we keep growing as we are today in terms of the aviation sector? And the answer is that you would need 130% of all the electricity that's being produced today in Europe as low carbon, of course, because you don't want dirty hydrogen, so you need to make it low carbon, just annually to be able to serve this aviation demand.
Within Europe?
Within Europe. Yeah, this is from a paper that just looked at Europe. Yeah,
that's impossible, I think.
That clearly shows that there are some limitations. You can be a techno-optimist, and I think it's good to have a bit of a techno-optimist in yourself, but you also need to be pragmatic and to be sort of this balance between what's feasible, what's not, what kind of physical limits are we looking at. There are very hard physical limits around us. This has been theorized in the form of planetary boundaries, the expression. One of them is this carbon budget we still have. So we have, I think, 600 billion tons of CO2 to emit until we reach our 2-degree warming. What do we do in this space, maneuverable space of 600 billion tons? We can still emit a little bit, but we have to be very smart as to how we emit it, why, and if we can manage to develop low carbon technologies in the meantime.
Again, we went to a very sad place, I have to say, right? So can we finish in something more positive? Maybe going back to what we said before, right? Go back, rewind to when Thomas was talking about what is possible for you at a local one-person level, how to change, right? What else? What do we want the listeners to be left with?
There are many ways you can influence also others. So, of course, you can make the changes yourself. As we explained, there's the main reasons you emit carbon today is basically by traveling by plane, using your car, and eating meat, and also heating your house. So if you take any action on any of those topics, even a little, would be a step in the right direction. And then you can start understanding what others are doing, start talking about this question also with people who are a bit aware of it. In the broader scale, you can also vote for people who propose solutions. That's one powerful way. It's rare because it happens once every 4 or 5, I don't know, wherever you live, but 5 years maybe. And so that needs to be said. And it's also influenced by what you buy. So I heard someone say that your voting card and your credit cards are probably the 2 most important cards you have to change things. I think it's true. Yeah, so there are many ways you can think about it. And I think it's also good to, once you know about the problem, of course, to act according to your convictions and to be more at peace with yourself. But that's only a personal opinion. I don't know if that applies to everyone.
Okay, we dropped a lot of food for thought for you today, I'm sure. And I will be probably listening to this episode a few times to just, to let different things sink in. Thank you so much for coming today.
Thanks for having me.
And this is it for today. Don't forget to subscribe, to follow us. We are basically on almost all the social media, writing about science, talking about science, about new episodes. We have a website as well that you can visit, remember, silex.eu. And we are also present on Patreon. So if you want to support us and let us grow, you can also go there. This was Silex, and my name is Hanna Siemaszko.